So this virtual meeting is about how can we prevent decisions getting slower, particularly in our meetings. So the overall flow of what we call kill bad meetings is a process, a consulting process, a training process for helping to halve the number and improve the quality of face-to-face and virtual meetings. And so we take people through a process really understanding the business case around this, because people are telling us they spend on average 2 days a week in meetings and 50% of it is irrelevant. So it's not hard to find a business case and ROI for making an improvement. It then starts with cutting out unnecessary topics and participants. We're going to talk a little bit about unnecessary participants in decision making, but we've also found that about 40% of everything that happens in meetings doesn't need a meeting. Things like information giving, sharing data, those kind of things. And it's only when you've done those things that it's worth starting to improve the conduct of your meetings and decisions. So we'll talk a little bit on how do we design our meetings to be more effective at decision making, and then how do we run those meetings to make decisions quickly and involving the right people. But a lot of organizations have tried to make these changes in the past and haven't been able to sustain an improvement. And we think they've done that because they didn't do step 2. Because if you don't cut out the unnecessary stuff, especially if that's half of the content, then all you're doing by improving your facilitation and your meeting conduct is getting better at doing stuff that didn't need to happen in the first place. So you have to take that step 2 on this process before you can be successful later on. You also need to think about, and we're going to talk about this in a few moments, what are the cultural reasons why people are resistant to not being involved in decisions, not being invited to meetings. And we also need increasingly to apply all of this to our virtual meetings, because often now we're not face-to-face, we're meeting through tools like this one. And so it is a little bit different creating engagement, participation in that environment. And we're going to talk explicitly about that later on. So we'd like to start off with a poll. We're going to ask you a few questions about decision making. So if you could load the poll, please, that would be good. But that's the wrong poll, actually. That's the poll that goes with the slide later on. Okay, thank you. So as you'll see from the scroll bar on the right-hand side, you may need to scroll down with that bar to answer all the questions. So let's just take a moment to find out what you think of decisions in your meetings right now. Okay, if you're not familiar with using polls in your webinars, then polls are a good way of collecting data, getting interaction with your audiences and getting them involved. So we're just going to wait about another 5 seconds to get a few more answers, and then you'll start to see the results coming up on the screen. Okay, so most people think you actually make pretty good quality decisions in your meeting. So that's good news that we get there in the end, although 29% of people don't think that the quality of decisions is that good. About 57% disagree and 14 strongly disagree with the idea that we make decisions fast enough. So as I mentioned in the introduction, speed is a big issue. So even if we make good decisions, we'd like to get them quicker. Too many people are involved. Again, a majority of people think that too many people are involved in decisions, which is another of the things we found in many of our clients. And a very large majority of people think that it's generally that it's clear who should make the decision. So we'll come back and talk about that as to why they think then that some of their decisions are slow. Okay. Let me. Okay, so one of the things that has an impact on decision making is actually our culture. all the things that we do, the way we meet, the way we decide is rational in our corporate culture. And so very often when we look at things like slow decisions or too many meetings, that's a symptom of other things that are going on below the waterline, under the iceberg. And so a lot of organizations have grown up with a kind of high involvement, high participation culture. And that can go one of two ways. One, you could be a startup, you could be a small organization. And as you grow, you've been used to everyone being involved in everything. And that's great when there's 10 of you, more difficult when there's 1,000 of you. So a lot of organizations we work with that are in growth or startup mode are feeling that, I'm now having to disengage from decisions I used to know about. Or it could be you're a large organization and starting to become more integrated. So you've had a culture of involvement in local teams, in local sites, but now you're connecting with global organizations or in a matrix structure. And suddenly there's potentially so many people involved that the old high involvement culture becomes hard to deliver in that environment. So cultures that have a strong high involvement and participation ethos tend to have teams for everything. Yeah, so we collaborate a lot and everyone's expected to have a say in that environment. And that sounds great and it's very egalitarian. But eventually, if you're working on very large teams, it becomes very difficult to get a quality of discussion in that. Very often, those same organizations tend to be high control and a little bit risk averse and even low trust. Not always, but that can be a challenge. And all of these can be reasons why more people might stay involved in a decision because they want to know what's going on. It's expected that they know what's going on. The costs of getting things wrong are very high and trust may be undermined. And all of those things may lead to more and more people staying involved in decisions. So when we get to the tip of the iceberg, slow decisions, there are a lot of underlying things that we may need to deal with if we really want to improve the way we make decisions. So we're going to pull this down into 3 key principles that we're going to explore in more detail. So we can speed up and simplify a decision by, first of all, involving only the right people in the decision. Secondly, involving them at the right time in the process. And thirdly, being really clear about the process. How are you going to make these decisions? And if we can get those 3 things right, then we can probably accelerate our decision making in meetings. Now, there's also work you could do around accelerating very large scale decision processes in your business, like how we manage innovation, how we make strategic choices. This webinar isn't really about that. This is more about how you do that in the context of a meeting. So the first thing we found when we started to go in and observe meetings for many of our clients is that between 10 and 20% of participants at the meetings shouldn't be there at all. They don't participate, they're not engaged, or they may be there for some other reason, for example, to manage their visibility that's not relevant to the topics of the meeting. And the interesting thing we found when we ask our clients is they already know who these people are. So just take a moment to think about the teams or meetings that you're part of. Is there one person on that team who you think is a passenger, who doesn't really need to be there? By the way, if you're thinking that, then probably everyone else on the meeting or team is thinking the same. So usually they're not hard to spot, but it can be difficult to have the conversation about leaving them out. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about that at the end, about how we overcome inertia and how we manage to achieve more change. So I think now would be a good time to kind of take a pause and see if we've got any questions. If you've got any questions about what we've talked about so far, could you type them into the Q&A box?
Kevin, we already have one here from Jenny. I'll read it out.
Yep.
It's somewhat long. We get called into long meetings, even though it's obvious we're not all needed for the entire duration. A few weeks ago, I tried to get out early and get some work done by asking if we could go through my bit first. I was told by my manager that I wasn't being a team player and I could learn by sticking around for the rest of the meeting. What should I do next time?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We take meetings as, not coming to the meeting is a sign that you don't love the person who's running it or don't respect them. So there's all these kind of things going on. Towards the end, we're going to talk a little bit about how do you position it appropriately. What we should be doing is making the people who leave and get back to work the heroes. So sometimes you've got to position it a little bit in your in the way you put that message across. So if you can have a conversation with people before the meeting and say, look, it looks like the first couple of topics are relevant for me. Is it okay if I leave after that because I have to do some stuff around customers, or I'm trying to save cost or whatever it may be. But if you can get that into the design, so you focus on what we call the spaghetti, the stuff that everyone's interested in first, then that's very helpful. It might be worth having a conversation offline rather than publicly in the meeting, where you've got a little bit more time to think with the meeting organizer and arrange that for next time. But you do have to do it in a sensitive way, because people react strangely to you telling them their meetings are useless. Okay, there's a question here from Bakir about the slides. Do we send a copy, Gavin, of the slides afterwards, or a link to?
Yeah, we'll do. There'll be a follow-on email at the end of the webinar, so absolutely. Okay,
and Bakir, you'll also get a link so that you can come back to this if you want to share it with any of your colleagues. Okay. So the second thing really is being clear about who you need to, who you need to involve in the decisions. And there is a tendency, if we're not clear, for everyone to get involved. And I guess many of you are familiar with the idea of RACI. And a RACI analysis is where, for a given task or a given decision, you identify who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed. So accountable is the kind of buck stops here. That's the person who is responsible for the decision in the final analysis. Responsible is the people who do the work. Consulted are the people you need to consult to find out their views, and informed are the people you need to tell about what happened. So all of those people can participate in a decision. What I'd like you to do, you should see a chat box on your screen. I'd like you to, in the chat box, type which of these roles, so the RACI, should be involved before the meeting rather than at the meeting itself. So just type which one you think it is and hit send. Okay, Peter, I'm seeing responsible and accountable. You think they should be involved before the meeting? Okay, I've got consulting from William. Okay, thank you, Peter. Yeah. Okay, so if you think about the responsible and accountable, of course, they're involved in the process, but in the meeting itself, if you're consulting with people, then it's very helpful to engage with those people before the meeting so that you can get their views, but they don't need to be at the meeting. And the reason for that is that people who are being consulted are not necessarily the decision makers. So if you invite the consulted people to the meeting, then you may well find that they think they have a vote, they get involved, and they want to be part of the decision process itself. But consulted is something that you can do before the meeting. There may be political reasons or other reasons why you invite them to the meeting, but technically you can do the C's outside the meeting, and that does help reduce the number. So again, in the chat box, which of these roles do you think could be involved after the meeting? So again, don't necessarily need to be in the meeting, but could be involved after. So again, type that please in the chat box. Bakir, you think the informed? William, the accountable? Steve, informed and consulted. Yeah, it's good practice to go back and re-inform the consulted people as well after the meeting, so they understand that the loop has been closed. Yeah, I think it's particularly the informed. So the informed, once you've made a decision, we need to let people know what that decision is. So if you think about the sequence of involvement, if you want to try and limit the number of people in your meetings to try and focus your decisions, because generally speaking, smaller groups make better decisions. There was some research done recently that showed that if you involved more than, I think it was 5 buyers in a buying decision, it was about 30% less likely to happen. So the less people you have, the more likely you are to reach a decision, and the easier the process. So if we can have the consulted people beforehand, if we can inform people afterwards, we can focus the meeting on the responsible and accountable people who are really will have skin in the game, as they say, on the decision. So this allows us to streamline the process of involvement of people. What we see with a lot of our clients is they're not very good at the stakeholder management part of consulting, and they're not very good at communication afterwards. And because of that, they tend to invite everyone to the meeting. And that's one of the reasons they get so many people in the meetings themselves. So we had a couple of different views on that one. If you've got any questions around that, please type them in the question and answers box.
Kevin, we have one that came in as you were speaking there. It's from Philip. How do you deal with people who used to be involved in decision making but aren't anymore?
Yeah, that's a big challenge because people like to stay involved, and I'm sure we've all had projects and meetings where people come along for historical reasons rather than to add a great deal to the exercise. I think it's about having a conversation with them about their role. These are probably the same people who complain about going to too many meetings. And remember, people are telling us 50% relevance 2 days a week. So there's a day a week of wasted time. So the win-win here is giving them the opportunity to withdraw gracefully. And when I've done that live in meetings and I've challenged that with people, the vast majority of times people have actually been quite relieved because they kind of knew it too, but felt it was perhaps impolite or difficult to disengage. So I think people are very often open to that. And if they're not, then you probably need to have a tough conversation about which of those 4 roles are they? Are they really consulted? Are they really a decision maker? Or are they consulted? Or are they informed? So that framework can be helpful in unpicking the kind of involvement you need people to have. Okay. Any others, Gavin?
There's a somewhat similar but a little bit more detail in it from Lorraine. Meetings are a big time stealer for us. We've tried shorter ones with less people, but once the whispering starts by people who are left out, we've ended up including them again and going back to the larger, slower meetings. How can we change?
Yeah, and I do think you have to be systematic about it. Going back to one of my first slides about the kill bad meetings process. In the book, we have quite an interesting tool, which is a simple checklist. So you write the names of the topics down one side and the participants across the other. And then what you do very simply is every time someone speaks, you make a tick in the relevant box. And when you get to the end of the meeting, you have a graphical record of who actually engaged and participated. And you can use that to drive a really, really good conversation about, why are some of these people here when they don't contribute? They don't seem to do anything with the outputs of the meeting. And I think as if you think about the level of productivity we're talking about 50% waste in our meetings. We wouldn't accept that in any other part of our business. If you went along to your boss and said, we're going to come up with a new product, obviously it's going to fail 50% of the time, or we're opening a new factory, obviously 50% of it will be scrap, I suspect we get fired. So I think we have to apply that same rigor to our meetings and our decisions because there's a colossal amount of waste. And by the way, if I asked you the same question, how many of your emails are irrelevant, then I suspect the number would be closer to 75%. So there's a lot of waste in our communication, in our meetings, and our decisions. And I think we just have to get a lot tougher about raising that. And having some data, like the meetings tick sheet, is a really good way to start the conversation. Okay, I will continue if that's okay, Gavin.
Absolutely.
So the next issue to talk about is being clear about how we make our decision, or our decision modes. And you'll see on the model here, we've got 2 axes, individual and collective decisions. And do we make the decisions based on expertise or based on authority? And you can see the 4 different ways of making decisions. We could fine tune, there's a few more, but these are the main ones. So either the boss decides, and that's based on authority, an empowered individual decides, what's called a collegiate decision. That's where the boss talks to everybody, but at the end of the day, they decide. And then, of course, we have fully collective decisions. And collective decisions tend to be made by either a vote, so 51% of people agree, or a consensus, which in theory is where everyone agrees, but often I observe it's when enough people have given up the will to live and stopped disagreeing. So it could go either way with those. So these are the 4 major modes for making decisions. So if we think about then, how do these decisions, these ways of making decisions have an impact on how quickly we make decisions and how involving the process is? And we'd like to do a short poll on this. So if we could add the poll over the top of that slide, please. Okay, so again, we're asking you, what do you think is the fastest way to decide of those 4? Which is the slowest? And which do you think is the most involving? So again, you may need to scroll down to see the bottom question. If you'd like to answer that, and we'll then discuss the results. This is an exercise we do live on our training programs. We ask people to decide how decisions are made in their teams and also how that feels in terms of involvement and speed. And I'll give you some feedback on what they tell us in a moment. Okay, yeah, so the fastest ones, unsurprisingly, are the ones where the individual decides. So the boss or the empowered individual. And I have to say, I'm a massive fan of empowered individuals being allowed to get on and do their jobs, make their decisions, rather than have to report back to a meeting a few weeks later. The slowest way, it's interesting, one person thought the empowered individual, most people thought team consensus. I think generally it takes longer collectively to discuss and agree on things. Which is the most involving? Again, this is very common that people tend to vote the team modes as more empowering. But there's one individual there, and I actually often point this out on our training courses, that it depends who you ask. So if you're the individual who's empowered to do the job, but you still have to come back and discuss it with a group, then that doesn't feel very empowering at all. Similarly, by the way, if you're the boss and it's your job and you still have to come back and consult with everybody, that can feel disempowering. So most people assume that involvement is collective. And I guess we just ought to think about, can involvement also be individual? And that's why I'm such a fan of individual empowerment. If we can get that right, then people feel individually very empowered, but may not feel as collectively empowered. So when we run this kind of exercise in our training programs, what we do is we ask people with Post-it notes to locate the different Post-it notes, the different ways of making a decision on a grid, as you can see here, on involvement and time. And this is a typical output that they get, which is very similar to the feedback that you gave us. And so what you then do with this, having understood that, is you discuss in your team which of the routine decisions that we make in our meetings are we going to make in each of these different ways. And so you can map out for your teams any routine, any regular decisions you're going to make, be explicit about how you're going to make them. And the reason that's so important is that if you don't do that, it tends to default to full team consensus. Because we have this kind of very strong attachment to teamwork and involvement, if there's 15 people in the meeting, consensus feels like the right way to do it. And so if you're not explicit, it will tend to default to full team consensus. And as we've seen, that's the slowest way to get things done. So if we want speed, we want to pull some of our decisions down into those more simple ways, more fast ways of making decisions. So any questions? If you have any questions around decision making and decision processes, now's the time to type them into the Q&A box.
Kevin, we have one here already. It's from Jay Doyle, who says, we have some people who say nothing in meetings. Some are quite technical, so their input will be really valuable, but they just don't speak up, and management presses on with its own agenda. How can we get them to speak up?
Yeah, we do, and this is also a particular challenge on virtual meetings where it's even harder for some people to contribute. I've recently been doing a series of webinars with people in China, and it's very difficult to get that done. So what I do is I create what I call a virtual meetings table, and you could do this in a live meeting as well. And I literally draw a table in front of me, and I put the names of the people around it. And every time someone speaks, I put a tick against their name. And then over time, I can quickly see who's contributing and who's not. So then I'll try and draw people in by name and make sure that they've been involved. A fun exercise you can do in face-to-face meetings is to give everyone 10 counters or coins and put them in front of them in the meeting. And every time they talk, they spend 1 counter. And if they talk a lot, they spend 2. And what happens very quickly is the people who are very high contributors, they quickly realize they're running out of money. So they kind of tend to moderate the amount that they speak. And the ones who haven't spent any counters at all, they feel as though they should contribute. So I should say that the amount you speak is not as you said, not the indicator of quality. But if you want to moderate involvement, that's a good way of doing it. And it's interesting, some of the recent research by Google on their people analytics has found that an equal contribution of people in a team is a very strong indicator of the success of that team. So if you do have people like that, you do have to control the high contributors and try and bring in the less vocal people. That's a really good point.
There's another one, thank you, Kevin, from Alexandra. Quite interesting, actually. How to deal with people who want to be involved in making a decision, but they aren't responsible for the task and they don't have the expertise.
Yeah, I guess RACI is a good tool for going back to them and trying to locate them. And with somebody like that, you probably do RACI and you come up with the answer that they aren't any of those things. And so why are they getting involved? It may be there's someone that is being consulted. I'm reminded of a session we ran with a client in the Arab world, and they were using a version of RACI called DISC, which is about the decision maker, informed, supported, and consulted. And people were very reluctant to give up the decision making. And even though it was clear they weren't the decision maker, people kept getting involved to the extent that a couple of the guys were shouting at each other, give up your D, give up your D. So I think people are very often reluctant to do it, but tools like DISC or RACI are a good way of, and you do have to push back, because otherwise we end up with everyone involved, and even some people getting involved after the decision is made who shouldn't have been involved in the decision, who derail it. So that's one of the big contributors to making decisions too slow. Okay, I will continue if I can, Gavin, is that okay?
Absolutely, great.
Okay, so if we want to design and run great meetings, including decisions, then we need a clear facilitation process and design process for that. And the process we use in the book is called OPPT. So it starts with being really clear about the outcome. So what are we trying to achieve? And very often you must have had an agenda where on the agenda it says something like business review. And so you go along and you discuss something for a while, and then you find the decision was already made. Yeah, it's not clear from a traditional agenda. What am I supposed to do? What's my role in this? What are we specifically trying to achieve? So if you want a clear outcome, what decision are we trying to make? So that's the outcome. The second step is the process. What are the set of steps that we need to take that will lead us inevitably to achieve that planned outcome? And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. So be clear about the process steps. And once you're clear about the outcome and the process steps, you can then answer the question, are the right people in the room? And do they have a role? Are we going to enable them to participate in this properly? And I'm going to talk much more about that. And finally, very simply, but very obviously, are we clear about timing? And we've all been involved in these discussions where we spent 3 hours discussing something that's worth about $200. So we ought to be clear about, for our expensive and valuable and scarce time, how much time are we prepared to spend on that? And I'll show you a worked example. So here is, if we were planning a meeting, let's say the outcome that we wanted was to select a new supplier. So the process steps might be, first of all, we agree the criteria. Secondly, we discuss the leading vendors. And then we have a decision based on either the ranking, or if that's not clear, majority voting. So those steps will pretty reliably lead you to the outcome if you deliver them. So then we look at, for each of those steps, who does what? So in this case, the commercial manager drives the process. We all discuss and agree. We have post-it notes to do a ranking exercise on the walls, and then we have a vote and someone to document and communicate it afterwards. So if you plan your meetings in this way, you're clear about the outcomes, the process, the participants and how they'll engage, and the time, then you normally have a really good chance of achieving your objective. If you just turn up saying the objective is new supplier, then people don't necessarily know what their role is. You don't necessarily have a process in place. You're much less likely to achieve your goal. And we're quite tough on this. Our belief is if there's no role for the participants, there's no need for a meeting. There's about 40% of what happens in meetings when we analyze them is information giving. And that's stuff that nowadays we could do by email, we could do by shared spaces. We could put them on document areas where we can discuss and debate them through text. And so our organization is virtual itself. So we have people spread around the world. If we're going to discuss an important issue, make an important decision, we will normally put a discussion document on a tool we use called Huddle. People will add to it, debate it in text form. So by the time we get to the meeting, we've probably resolved 80% of it, or maybe all of it. So at the meeting, we'll only discuss the small number of things that are still to be resolved. Or sometimes we just look each other in the eyes and say, okay, have we decided? And we just do a commitment. So if you look at, when you're planning a meeting like this or a decision like this, if you start doing your OPPT process and you find actually there is no role for participants, then that's good news, because it means you don't need a meeting. You could probably do it through email or some other form of technology. So this is quite a challenge. And I think if you think about the meetings you go to, how many of them do you have an active role? If you don't have an active role, there was probably a simpler way of getting that information to you. So the things we tend to focus on is, first of all, if you want to build participation, you've got to think about the audience experience. You know, it's a very digital thing to say nowadays. Start with the customer experience. But if you're going, for example, to a big lecture hall and you've got rows of chairs in the dark and you've got a stage at the front with big lights on, then the message is clear, right? Watch me, I'm the presenter, instead of what's the focus of the audience. So think about the audience. For each outcome and process, ask yourself, what are the participants doing? And if they're doing nothing or listening to you, then maybe there's another way of getting it across. Small groups really help with this, almost by definition. Once you get above probably 6 to 8 people, it starts to get more difficult to get everyone engaged. And you've got to do it early. Remember, we started with a poll quite quickly in this session to give you a role to start doing things. And we use the chat box and a couple of other tools. If you don't do that, if you present for an hour and then at the end ask for questions, then you tend not to get it because you've trained people to shut up and listen. Wherever possible, involve people in the generation and creation of materials and ideas. If the idea is already fixed, then you may not need a meeting. So creation of materials, creation of ideas, active discussion, co-creation, that's the purpose of live meetings. And make the room layout match the process. I used my example of the big lecture hall. You look at traditional university lecture halls where you're all sitting around in a row looking at the professor. Very difficult to talk to your peers or to have small group discussions in that context. And try and engage the senses, you know, get people to move around, take regular breaks, use color. We even use music quite a lot in our training programs, just to try and engage people beyond the normal everyday sitting in a boring meeting. And when you try and do that virtually, when we try and apply that in a webinar situation, there's a number of principles, a number of tools we can use. So asking questions, polling, which you've had a go at today, voting, breaking people into subgroups you could do in many of the technologies, sharing your screen as I'm doing now. In a smaller group, you can hand over control to other people and let them do things. Taking regular breaks. This is quite a short session, but if you're going over an hour, we'd recommend you take a break about every hour, 45 minutes. Enabling questions, as we've done here, so people can interact. Using materials that call for interaction, as we've done a little bit here. Again, limiting the audience size helps. If we're running very interactive webinars, we kind of recommend they're down to about 6 people. Otherwise, it's quite hard to get everyone engaged in a reasonable period. And also integrate other media. So not everything has to be done in the meeting. You can send people to shared documents. You can send people to social spaces and those kind of things as well. And there's a green tick against the ones we've been able to use in this context. Obviously, with large group sizes, it gets harder to do some of these things. But as you're applying it perhaps in smaller groups, look for ways to build in all of these fairly regularly in the way that you interact. So this is quite an interesting area, I think, creating participation. Do you have any questions around this whole participation area? Gavin, anything come in on that?
We have one, but it may be referring back to an older slide from Simon. Our problem in my team is that we have lots of meetings, but the boss then decides outcomes on his own against the team's better judgment. Despite a string of bad decisions, he's still in place because he's got some kind of favoritism amongst senior management in our company. How can we get around him?
That's a difficult one. It's always difficult to change your boss. I would say, you know, you can all you can do fundamentally is change yourself. And so maybe having a conversation with him about the process he's using to involve. If that really is the process and you can't change it, it might be easier for him to consult with you one-on-one rather than a meeting. I had a very similar experience early in my career where my boss had moved in from another part of the same group. And he asked me and my colleagues to come up with a new organization structure. And we came up with a few things, and it was very evident he already had the answer in his head. And so I just rang his previous department and said, please send me your organization chart. And I just copied that. And when I presented it, he said, oh, that's very good. Yeah, I can see what you've done there. And I said to him, look, if that's what you want, why don't you just tell us? And about 3 weeks later, I moved into another department. So I'm not sure I'm the best example of how to resolve that. But I think it is difficult to change your boss. And at the end of the day, you have to make a choice as to whether it's worth your while staying in that kind of environment because you're unlikely to be able to change it. Thanks,
Kevin. There is one more, somewhat more on topic. we have a number of people that we would like to discourage from participating in our meetings, and it's from John. How can we do that? I think it ties back into the earlier question about getting some people to speak up, and then in this case, getting some people to not speak up.
Yes, indeed. I mean, in the book, we talk about a number of the classic people. We have a guy called Visi Bill. Visi Bill comes along because he wants to tell you all the great things he's been doing. So he's there to manage his visibility. You've got other people who are multitasking, and basically when they're multitasking, they're telling you this really isn't important to me. And so the meetings tick sheet, again, is a really good tool for going back and discussing that with people and being explicit about it. Sometimes you've got to be quite tough, really ask people what they think their contribution is to the meeting. If you've got a clear OPPT process, you can go through that and say, well, what's your role in this? And very often it's nothing. Sometimes, in my experience, it's legacy. I worked with a marketing team recently, and they had someone who'd come along for the last 3 years from supply chain because there'd been a supply chain mistake 3 years ago. And so this guy turned up to the marketing meetings, and his role was to tell them if anything was going wrong. But he sat in the meeting silently for all the time, apart from maybe 20 minutes where he gave his update. And at that point, when that came out on the tick sheet, we suggested to him that he didn't need to come if there was no problems, first of all. And secondly, if there were, he could join by video conference for 20 minutes. So that saved the guy. I think the meeting was 3 days at a time, 4 times a year spread around the world. So that immediately saved him about 15 days of work and business travel. So most people I've found are quite open to that. If they're not, then really it's understanding why do they think they have a place in this? Is it a trust issue? Is it a control issue? Some of the corporate cultural things we talked about under the waterline of the iceberg might be the things we need to address. Okay, I'll continue if I may, Gavin.
Great, thanks, Gavin.
So, as we've seen, in principle, these ideas are pretty simple, but many of the questions have been around how do we, sorry, I've got Steve Alexandra coming up on chat saying that we can't hear you. Is anyone else having that experience? Perhaps you could type in chat if you can hear us okay. So there's a comment there from Steve Alexandra saying we cannot hear you. I'm not sure if that's a more general problem.
I think that might have been me, Kevin.
Okay, fine.
I'll have to improve my muting and unmuting skills.
Okay, fine. Okay, good. I think everybody else, yeah, and Steve's back on now, so that's good news.
Great.
So thank you for that. Thank you for pointing that out, Steve. So if we want to influence others, that's the challenge. So the ideas are not complex, but we have resistance for whatever reason, and we've talked about some of them. So 3 key principles. First is framing the change. So if you're not going to go to a meeting, if you're going to leave someone out of your decision, then it's really good to frame why you're doing that as something that's really valued by your culture. So if your culture is very customer oriented, then the reason you're doing it is because the customer needs a decision quicker, or you need to save time because you've got a customer issue. If efficiency is valued in your culture, then it's about efficiency. So think about the framing of it. If it's just, you're not invited to my meeting, people may see that negatively. If you frame it appropriately, usually you can get away with it. Secondly, deal with objections from your key stakeholders. For example, a lot of stakeholders say, well, I have to come to the meeting because I don't get told what's happening. So the answer might lie in improving our communication rather than necessarily having them in the discussion. Or they may say, I don't feel like I'm involved, in which case you can have a discussion, which is, what does involvement mean? Is that we consult with you? Is that we tell you more about what's going on? Or does that mean you need to come to the meeting? Because those people are probably also spending at least a day a week in unnecessary meetings. And thirdly, try and provide some visibly better alternatives. So if, for example, you can use the idea of discussing things online, which will speed up the decision and also make the meeting itself more efficient, then that can be a genuinely better alternative. And once people see that, they're more likely to use it going forward. Do remember the cultural issues. So if you've got lots of people turning up at your meetings, is it something else than wanting to be involved in the decision? Is it a trust issue? Is it that we're too risk averse? Is it that we're a high control environment? These things can be quite hard to change, depending where you sit in the organization. But it is worth having a conversation, if you think that's the issue, with your boss or maybe with your organization development or HR people, about how can we change some of these fundamental assumptions? Because if we don't, then we're going to go back to slow decisions. And an example we often use is people who travel a lot. When there's a travel freeze, perhaps there's a budget freeze or a security concern, and everyone stops traveling. just about everyone says, well, that was great, actually. It made things better. We got more done. We didn't have senior managers visiting us every week. They were very positive about it. But as soon as the budget freeze was relaxed, then the travel comes back, because we haven't equipped people to do things in another way than travel. So we haven't equipped people to use tools like this. We haven't equipped people to manage remotely or to build trust across cultures, whatever it might be. So if you don't deal with the things below the waterline, there's a chance it's harder to sustain an improvement in your decision making and in your meetings. So as I've mentioned a couple of times, there's a pretty substantial kind of size of a prize here. People are telling us on average they spend a day a week, 2 days a week in meetings, and half of it's irrelevant. So that's a day a week. And you'll see here an infographic that we did for one of our clients based on 100 people. And overall, that's costing about £3 million a year in unnecessary meetings. So it's very significant. It's not hard to create an ROI. And if you take a look on our website, I use the email address at the bottom there that you'll see, meetings@global-integration.com. We can show you how to get one of those made for your company. So if you want to save a day a week, obviously we've been focusing on decisions, but there's a lot more in the book Kill Bad Meetings around the other aspects of meetings. So how you create collaboration, how you run virtual meetings, how you identify and get rid of those unnecessary participants and topics we've been talking about. There is a free diagnostic you can do via our website, so you can see what is the cost of the meetings and where are the key challenges. We also offer consulting, meeting observation and coaching on how you do that, both face-to-face and through webinar and through entirely online learning or blended solutions. So there's a couple of links there if you want to find out more about Kill Bad Meetings and the services around it. So we're coming towards the end of the input session. We do have up to 15 minutes if we need it for questions. So if you have any last questions for us, please type them now into the Q&A box.
Kevin, there is one here from Sarah Kay. It says, I'm interested in implementing what you are describing, but I'm worried about negative consequences and being poorly perceived. When you have gone back into organizations, how have the people who've implemented these fared?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's and one of the reasons actually we got into this is because of exactly that. One of our clients said, you know, people come on the training programs around matrix management, virtual teams, of which this is one of the topics, and then they go back into the organization and they want to make a change, but there's tremendous inertia for people who haven't had the same experience. So we developed the Kill Bad Meetings process to apply to intact teams or meetings, and that's really the best. If it's you as a lone voice, it's quite hard to get across. I think the meeting survey is a really great way to do that. We were talking recently, Alan and I, with a Japanese company, and the group there, they use the meeting survey. And of course, once you've done the survey, you're giving people back their data. So if through the survey you find that everybody feels the same, then you're on a very strong position to do something with it. So try and engage the collective in it, I think. What we train tens of thousands of people every year, and very consistently people are frustrated by this. So I think you'll find there's lots of other people than just you frustrated by it. So seek them out and try and create a coalition and try and create some data.
Great. We have another a topical one from Peter. Just one question around framing a change as being beneficial to the business. Can you give examples of this, i.e. how to tell someone the meeting is better without them, especially more senior personnel?
Yes, well, I probably wouldn't start with the senior personnel. They're always the more difficult ones, and you've got to, in real life, you've got to choose your battles. But I think the meetings tick sheet is a really great tool for initiating that conversation. And so you basically go back to people saying, look, I notice, you're here for a whole day. You only contributed once. Is that okay for you? Is that a good use of your time? Is there a way that we could kind of meet your needs without you needing to spend a whole day? I mean, that's a very kind of nice conversation to have if you're the chairman of a meeting. If it's your boss or your boss's boss, it can be really hard to do that. But you might have a similar conversation saying, it was great that you were here. It's nice that you show the importance of this. Is there a way we can give you what you need so that, outside the meeting, is coming to the meeting the right way for you to do that? Because these people are normally even busier than we are.
Super. I think we have one last one. It's from Philip. I've tried something similar to the tick sheet before, but had very, very negative feedback. I'm not the most senior on the team, and this may have been part of the reason. Any suggestions?
Yeah, I've not really had negative feedback on it. I guess as an external person, you kind of get a little bit more leeway, and people, because they're paying you, they have to kind of listen to what you've said. So you could hire us to come in. Obviously, that would be a great solution. But yeah, I think it is hard to change the inertia. I think, we did a survey recently with one of our clients of 1,600 managers, and they told us, again, they were spending, wasting over a day a week. And then we asked them, how satisfied are you with your meetings? And they scored 85%, which is crazy. People seem to have a very high acceptance for poor quality meetings. And so I would encourage you to, maybe have one-to-one conversations with the people who are running the meeting. Yeah, it's hard for me to know exactly how you did that on the day, and I can imagine if you make it too blunt, it is quite, you've been sitting here all day contributing nothing while you're here, then you're not going to get a good result. So I think some of it is the style of it. It might be worth taking a look at the book. You'll get some more ideas there about framing the conversations and collecting the data. So usually I found that data is a good way into it, but people can, as you found, react emotionally to being left out of things, and so it's time to have some adult conversations, I think. Otherwise, we'll all end up spending 20% of our time. And by the way, this is what it is now. As work becomes more collaborative and more connected, there's been a big increase in the amount of collaborative work, and with that, a big increase in the number of meetings. There's also been, virtual meetings are a mixed blessing. They've definitely reduced the cost and increased the ease of having meetings with distributed teams, but as a result, we're having more of them. And so we do have to be really careful as we grow, as we have more and more of these things, that we're a bit more selective. So I think if people don't address that, then we're starting to get swamped. And we add in together, emails and the other form of communication. And some of the research now shows that managers are spending, for example, 85% of their time communicating. And every time you go on a training course, the answer is, more teamwork and more communication. I don't think that can be the answer. Otherwise, we'll just run out of hours. So I think this is about being more selective about how you collaborate, how you spend your time.
Thanks, Kevin. We have another one from Matilda. How can I change the culture of the company? Should I start with my peers or with my boss? A common theme.
Yeah. It's a tough one. I mean, corporate cultures are really hard to change unless you have a crisis. So ideally, I would engage some of your organization development or HR colleagues into looking at some of these things, because if you can do something systematically across the organization, you can make a real change. However, I wouldn't use that as an excuse for not doing anything. I mean, sometimes people say, well, unless the CEO agrees, nothing happens. I don't agree. I think you can start and make a change in your own meetings, in your own teams, and you'll immediately get a benefit from that. And if people see that, and if you start to model it, then very often the thing spreads, because once people have experienced a really focused decision, a really good meeting, then they get dissatisfied about the others. When we're working with clients, we like to start with what we call aspirational groups. So if you can start with, a global marketing team or the leadership team, then that really does help. But if you can't, then I would say start with what you can control, prove to yourself that this stuff works, and then you can be an evangelist to other teams and other meetings you sit on to try and make an improvement. So I think it's wherever you are in the organization, you can start. If you get sponsorship from the top, that's fantastic. And something like the meeting survey can be a really good way of putting a number behind it, showing the financial impact across an organization. We worked with a large packaged goods company a couple of years ago, and they calculated that the cost of unnecessary meetings, so not the ones that needed to happen, but the unnecessary ones, was $500 million a year, and it was driving another 400 million of unnecessary business travel. So you add that together, a bit of preparation time, it was $1 billion issue. Now, if you can go back to your senior leadership with $1 billion issue, then they're more likely to pay attention to it.
I think that's all the questions we have at the moment, Kevin.
Okay,
so thank you very much.
If I could just wrap up on that then. So I'm going to hand back to Gavin. He has a couple of things he wants to say, but I just wanted to say thank you for your participation and your questions. We had some really good questions. And if there's any we didn't manage to answer live, we'll try and follow up on those afterwards. So thank you very much for attending. I hope it was useful to you, and I'll hand back to Gavin.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Probably just to reiterate what you said, thank you very much to our audience. It's an interesting topic for us. I certainly found that quite engaging because we've done some parallel analysis, as it were, on thousands of our past conference calls from our own customers. And what we found is, going by the statistics, that on average, participants, the last participant will dial in a full 13 minutes after the first participant on conference calls, which, if you take your average hourly conference call, that's effectively almost a quarter of the entire meeting effectively wasted. So we have developed a mobile app which cuts that out by dialing straight out to participants. There has to be a plug, of course, and something like this. But the good news is that for everybody in the audience today, you can try it out for free. We will follow up with a free link and free credit, which Alexander will follow up with. And in addition, we'll have all the slides from Kevan and Alan today. And any outstanding questions, you can let Alexander know. And once again, thank you very much to our audience for participating today. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you, folks. Bye-bye.